There is a phase every empath goes through that doesn't feel like a gift. It feels like something is wrong with you. You walk into a room and before anyone says a word, you already feel everything. The tension between two people pretending nothing happened, the quiet insecurity behind someone's smile, the resentment sitting underneath a casual conversation, the sadness no one is talking about, but somehow it's everywhere and none of it belongs to you. But somehow your body reacts like it does. Your chest tightens, your thoughts start racing, you feel the need to adjust, to soften the space, to say something that makes it better. Not because anyone asked you to, but because you can't not feel it. And that's the part no one explains. You don't just notice emotions, you absorb them. At first, it feels like connection. It feels like depth, like you understand people in a way most don't. And maybe that's what you've always told yourself, that this is your strength, that this is what makes you different. But if you're honest, it doesn't feel like strength. It feels exhausting because you're not just aware of what people feel, you carry it, you process it, you take responsibility for it, even when no one asked you to. And over time, that becomes your role without you ever choosing it. You become the one who fixes, the one who calms, the one who holds space for everyone else. And somewhere in the process, you disappear. Because when you feel everything and you treat everything like it's yours to deal with, you lose something essential. You lose the line between where you end and where other people begin. And once that line is gone, everything becomes confusing. Someone is distant and you feel like you did something wrong. Someone is stressed and your body starts reacting as if it's your problem to solve. Someone is angry and suddenly your entire nervous system is on edge trying to regulate something you didn't create. It happens fast, too fast to question. You don't sit there and think, is this mine? You just feel it. And because you feel it so strongly, you assume it must be. So you step in, you say more than you need to, you give more than you should. You adjust parts of yourself just to keep things stable, not because you're weak, but because you've never been taught where to draw the boundary. And over time, that turns into something dangerous. Your emotional state stops being your own. It becomes dependent on the people around you. If they're okay, you feel okay. If they're off, you feel off. If they pull away, you don't just notice it, you internalize it. And that's where the real problem begins. Because you're no longer just empathic, you're reactive. Your entire inner world starts responding to external signals without permission, without awareness, without control. And the more you do this, the more automatic it becomes, until one day you don't even know what you feel anymore, unless it's being triggered by someone else. And the hardest part is you probably thought this was what love looked like. You thought this level of sensitivity meant you cared more, that you were more connected, that you were doing something right. But here's the truth. Most people avoid saying, this isn't connection, this is the absence of separation. This is what happens when empathy exists without boundaries. And no one tells you this early enough, because the problem isn't that you feel too much. The problem is you never learned how to stop carrying what was never yours in the first place. At first, it doesn't look like a problem. In fact, it looks like something people admire about you. You're the one who understands without needing explanations, the one who can feel what others are going through, even when they can't put it into words. The one people turn to because you just get it, but what no one sees is what it costs you behind the scenes, because this doesn't just happen once in a while. It becomes a pattern that repeats itself over and over again. You walk into environments already scanning for emotional shifts. You notice the smallest change in tone, the slightest distance in someone's energy, the subtle withdrawal that most people would ignore, but you don't ignore it. You feel it immediately and your body reacts before your mind even catches up. And from that moment, the loop begins. Someone pulls slightly away and you lean in. Someone becomes quiet and you start questioning what you did wrong. Someone feels off and you take it as your responsibility to bring things back to normal. And the more this happens, the more automatic it becomes. You don't even pause to ask if it makes sense. You just respond, and the response is always the same. You give more, you try harder, you adjust yourself in ways that feel small in the moment, but slowly start to reshape who you are. And then something else begins to happen, something even more subtle. You start living in anticipation. You start thinking ahead of every interaction, replaying conversations before they even happen, preparing emotionally for shifts that may or may not come. You start overthinking everything, every message, every silence. Every change in behavior becomes something you need to analyze. And the more you analyze, the less stable you feel, because there is never a clear answer. Just more possibilities, more interpretations, more ways it could mean something is wrong with you. And that's where the confusion deepens, because on the surface, nothing is clearly broken. No one is openly rejecting you. No one is saying anything directly. But internally, you feel like you're constantly trying to fix something you can't fully see. And that creates a kind of emotional pressure that doesn't turn off. It follows you even when you're alone. You think about what you should have said differently, what you could have done better, what you might have missed. And without realizing it, you start blaming yourself for things that were never clearly yours to begin with. And this is where the loop tightens, because every time someone pulls back and then comes close again, you feel relief, a moment of calm, a sense that things are okay again. And that relief feels so real that it reinforces the entire cycle. It tells your mind that if you just try a little harder, understand a little deeper, give a little more, you can get back to that moment again. And so you stay, not because it's stable, but because the instability itself has become familiar. You get used to the highs and lows, the closeness followed by distance, the attention followed by silence, and your nervous system starts to adapt to that rhythm. It begins to expect it, even depend on it, and that's when it becomes difficult to step away, not because you don't see the pattern, but because part of you is now wired into it. You start confusing inconsistency with intensity, unpredictability with depth, emotional fluctuation with connection. And the more this happens, the more you lose touch with what steady actually feels like, because steady doesn't create the same emotional spikes. It doesn't pull you into overthinking. It doesn't force you to constantly adjust. And because of that, it can feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. So you stay in the loop, telling yourself that if you just understand a little more, if you just show up a little better, things will stabilize. But they don't, they repeat. And every repetition pulls you deeper into the same cycle, a cycle where you feel, react, overextend, question yourself, and then do it all over again. And the hardest part is that from the outside, it still looks like you're just someone who cares deeply, someone who gives, someone who loves fully. But on the inside, it doesn't feel like love anymore. It feels like something you can't quite control, something that keeps pulling you back in, even when part of you knows it's costing you more than it should. What makes this even more confusing is that on the surface, it looks like a relationship dynamic, like two people trying to understand each other, like miscommunication or timing or emotional differences. But underneath all of that, there is a much deeper mechanism at play, something that has very little to do with the specific person in front of you and far more to do with patterns that were built long before you ever met them, because the way you respond to inconsistency, the way you lean in when someone pulls away, the way you start questioning yourself instead of questioning the situation, none of that is random, it is learned. And most of the time it was learned early in environments where connection was not stable, where attention was not consistent, where emotional safety was something you had to figure out rather than something that was simply given. And when you grow up in that kind of environment, your nervous system adapts in a very specific way. It becomes highly sensitive to shifts. It learns to scan constantly, to pick up on subtle changes in tone and behavior, not as a skill at first, but as a form of protection. Because if you can detect the change early, you can adjust early, you can prevent disconnection before it fully happens. And over time, that becomes automatic. You don't think about it, you just do it. And the problem is that this pattern doesn't stay in the past. It follows you into your adult relationships, but now instead of protecting you, it starts trapping you. Because when you meet someone who is inconsistent, someone who comes close and then pulls away, your system doesn't see that as a warning sign. It recognizes it as something familiar, something it already knows how to respond to. And that familiarity can feel like connection. It can feel like depth, like intensity, like something meaningful is happening. But what is actually happening is your nervous system entering a loop it has practiced before. And that loop is built on unpredictability, because unpredictability creates spikes, moments of uncertainty, followed by moments of relief. And those shifts release chemicals in your brain that reinforce the cycle. When they pull away, you feel the drop, the anxiety, the need to fix something. And when they come back, you feel the relief, the validation, the sense that things are okay again. And that contrast becomes powerful, far more powerful than steady connection, because steady connection does not create the same highs and lows. It does not activate the same urgency. It does not make you feel like you have to earn your place. And if part of your identity has been built around earning connection, around proving your value through how much you can understand, how much you can give, how much you can hold for someone else, then you will naturally gravitate towards situations that allow you to play that role, not because you consciously choose it, but because it aligns with what your system already believes about how connection works. And this is where the confusion deepens even further, because from the outside, it looks like you are just someone who cares deeply, someone who is patient, someone who sees the good in people, even when it is not obvious. But internally, what is happening is much more complex. You are responding to emotional signals in a way that is tied to your own regulation. You are trying to stabilize what feels unstable, not just for them, but for yourself. And that creates a kind of dependency that is easy to miss, because it doesn't look like needing someone in the traditional sense. It looks like trying to help them, trying to understand them, trying to make the situation work. But underneath all of that, there is a need for resolution, a need for the emotional tension to settle. And when it finally does, even for a moment, it reinforces everything that led up to it. It tells your system that the effort was worth it, that the overthinking had a purpose, that the adjustment was necessary. And that is how the pattern sustains itself, not through logic, but through repetition, through emotional reinforcement, through a cycle that feels real enough to keep you invested, even when part of you starts to question it. And this is why simply knowing that something is not working is often not enough to break it, because the attachment is not just to the person, it is to the pattern itself, to the familiarity of the highs and lows, to the identity you step into within that dynamic. And until that is seen clearly, the loop continues, not because you are weak, not because you lack awareness, but because your system is doing exactly what it was trained to do, even if that training no longer serves you. And this is where the most uncomfortable realization begins to surface, because up until this point, it has always felt like the solution was simple. If you just tried a little more, if you just understood them better, if you just showed up in the right way at the right time, something would finally click and the inconsistency would disappear, the distance would close, the confusion would settle into something stable. And that belief is powerful because it gives you a sense of control. It tells you that the outcome depends on you, that if things are not working, it must mean there is still something you haven't done yet, something you haven't figured out, something you can still fix. But what if that belief is the very thing keeping you stuck? What if the reason the pattern keeps repeating is not because you haven't tried hard enough, but because trying harder is exactly what the pattern feeds on? Because when you look closely at what is actually happening, it doesn't follow the logic of growth. It follows the logic of reinforcement. You feel a drop when they pull away, a sense of unease, of uncertainty, of emotional discomfort that your system immediately wants to resolve. And in that state, you become more attentive, more available, more willing to adjust. And then when they come back, even slightly, even temporarily, that discomfort disappears, replaced by relief, by a sense of validation, by the feeling that something you did made a difference. And that moment locks the entire cycle in place, because now your system associates the relief with your effort, even if the two are not actually connected. And this is where the pattern becomes something much deeper than a relationship dynamic. It becomes a form of conditioning, a loop where unpredictability creates attachment, where inconsistency increases focus, where absence amplifies value. And without realizing it, you stop responding to the person and start responding to the cycle itself. And that cycle operates on something very specific: intermittent reinforcement, the same mechanism that keeps people hooked in situations that are not consistently rewarding, but occasionally give just enough to keep you engaged. And this is why stable connection can start to feel less intense, less compelling, even though it is healthier, because it does not create the same spikes. It does not pull you into the same emotional highs and lows. It does not make you feel like you are constantly earning your place. And if part of you has been wired to associate effort with value, to associate emotional labor with connection, then a dynamic that requires nothing from you can feel almost unfamiliar, even unsettling. So instead, you stay where the intensity exists, where the uncertainty keeps you engaged, where the emotional fluctuations create a sense of meaning. And this is the invisible trap, because from the outside, it still looks like you are choosing them, like you are invested in this person, like you are holding on to something real. But internally, what is happening is very different. You are responding to a loop that has learned how to keep your attention, how to keep you involved, how to keep you hoping. And the more you stay in that loop, the harder it becomes to separate what you feel from what is actually happening, because the intensity feels like truth. The attachment feels like depth. The effort feels like love. But none of those are reliable indicators of what the dynamic actually is. And this is where the shift becomes unavoidable, because once you begin to see the pattern clearly, once you recognize that the highs are directly tied to the lows, that the relief only exists because of the discomfort that came before it, that the connection feels strong precisely because it is inconsistent, you can no longer pretend that trying harder will change the outcome. You start to see that the loop does not break through effort. It sustains itself through it. And that realization is difficult because it removes the illusion of control. It forces you to face the possibility that there was nothing you could have done differently to make this stable, not because you were lacking, but because the dynamic itself was never designed to give you what you were trying to get from it. And once that becomes clear, the question is no longer, how do I fix this? It becomes, why am I still participating in something that only works when I lose myself inside it? There is a moment, and it usually doesn't happen all at once. It happens quietly, almost subtly, where something inside you starts to shift, not because the situation suddenly changed, not because they suddenly became different, but because you begin to see the pattern without immediately reacting to it. You notice the same sequence playing out again, the same distance, the same return, the same emotional pull. But this time something feels slightly off, not in the situation, but in your response to it. Because instead of immediately leaning in, instead of instantly trying to fix or understand or adjust, there is a pause, small at first, almost uncomfortable. And in that pause, you begin to observe rather than absorb. You begin to see what is actually happening instead of what you hoped was happening. And that changes everything, because for the first time, you are not fully inside the loop. You are looking at it, and what you start to notice is not just their behavior, but the repetition of it, the consistency of the inconsistency, the way the same emotional cycle keeps recreating itself regardless of what you do. And that realization is difficult because it challenges something you have been holding on to, the belief that if you just did it differently this time, the outcome would be different. But now you are seeing that the outcome has been the same all along, just disguised in slightly different moments. And once you see that, it becomes harder to continue blaming yourself, because the pattern exists independent of your effort, independent of how much you give, independent of how well you understand. And that is where the shift begins, not in what they do, but in how you interpret what they do. Because instead of asking, what did I do wrong? You start asking, what is this showing me? Instead of trying to close the distance, you start noticing why the distance exists in the first place. Instead of focusing on the moments when they come close, you start paying attention to the moments when they pull away. And what becomes clear is that the pattern is not random. It is structured. It follows a rhythm that is predictable once you stop being emotionally pulled into it. And that clarity creates something new. something you may not be used to feeling in this dynamic. It creates space between what happens and how you respond to it, space between the emotional trigger and your reaction. And in that space, you begin to feel something that wasn't there before, a sense of separation, not from them, but from the automatic response that used to define your behavior. And that separation is important because it allows you to see that the problem was never simply about you not being enough. It was about being inside a dynamic that required you to constantly prove something that was never going to stabilize. And once you understand that, something else starts to shift. Your need to fix it begins to weaken, not because you stop caring, but because you are starting to recognize that caring more does not change the structure of the pattern. It only keeps you inside it. And that realization can feel uncomfortable, even disorienting, because it removes the role you have been playing, the one who tries, the one who holds, the one who makes things work. And without that role, there is a moment where you don't quite know what to do, because for so long your sense of direction came from reacting to them, adjusting to them, staying engaged with the dynamic no matter how unstable it was. And now, for the first time, you are not doing that in the same way. You are not immediately stepping in. You are not overextending to restore connection. You are allowing the situation to reveal itself without interference. And that is where the real clarity begins to form. Because when you stop trying to control the outcome, you start seeing the reality of it. And the reality is not based on potential. It is based on pattern, not on what they could be, but on what they consistently show. And once that becomes clear, the emotional weight begins to shift. It doesn't disappear instantly, but it changes. It becomes less about urgency and more about understanding, less about fixing and more about deciding. And that is the turning point, the moment where your attention moves from trying to make it work to evaluating whether it ever truly could. And in that shift, there is a quiet but powerful realization. You were never stuck because you didn't try hard enough. You were stuck because you were trying to solve something that wasn't designed to be solved from your side. And once you see that, even briefly, even imperfectly, you can't unsee it. And that is where your power begins to return. Not all at once, not in a dramatic way, but in small, deliberate moments where you choose not to react the way you always have, where you choose to stay present instead of being pulled into the loop, where you choose to see what is there instead of what you wish was there. And those choices, even when they feel small, begin to change the entire dynamic, not by forcing it to become something else, but by allowing you to step out of it in a way you never could before. And this is where something starts to change, not on the surface where everything looks the same, but internally in a way that is much harder to reverse once it begins. Because after you see the pattern, after you recognize that your effort was never the missing piece, the question is no longer, how do I make this work? The question becomes, what happens if I stop responding the way I always have? And at first that feels unnatural, almost wrong, because your instinct has always been to move toward the tension, to close the gap, to fix what feels unstable. But now you begin to experiment with something different, something much quieter. You pause, not as a strategy, not as a technique, but as a way of not immediately giving your energy to something that has not proven it, deserves it, and that pause changes the dynamic more than anything you have done before. Because for the first time, you are not feeding the loop. You are not reinforcing the pattern that depends on your reaction to continue. And in that space, you begin to notice something important. When you don't move toward the inconsistency becomes clearer. When you don't rush to fill the silence reveals more than it used to. When you stop over-explaining, over-giving, over-adjusting, you begin to see what remains when your effort is no longer holding everything together. And that is where your power starts to come back, not as control over them, but as control over your involvement. Because power in this context is not about making someone behave differently. It is about no longer needing them to behave differently in order for you to feel stable. And that shift is subtle but profound, because it moves you out of dependency and into something much more grounded, something that does not fluctuate based on their presence or absence. And from that place, you begin to approach things differently. You are no longer reacting to every emotional signal. You are observing it. You are allowing it to exist without immediately turning it into something you need to act on. And that creates a kind of clarity that was not available to you before, because when you are not overwhelmed, you can see patterns without being pulled into them. You can recognize behavior without personalizing it. You can decide how to engage instead of being pulled into automatic responses. And that is where boundaries begin to form, not as rules you force yourself to follow, but as natural extensions of what you now understand. Because once you see that not everything is yours to carry, it becomes difficult to continue carrying it. Once you see that not every silence requires your response, it becomes easier to let it remain silent. Once you see that not every emotional shift is your responsibility to fix, it becomes possible to step back without guilt. And that is something many people misunderstand, because boundaries are often seen as something aggressive, something that pushes people away. But in reality, they are simply clarity in action. They define where you end and where someone else begins. They determine what you will engage with and what you will allow to exist without your involvement. And when you begin to operate from that place, your entire experience changes. You are no longer constantly adjusting yourself to maintain emotional balance around you. You are no longer overextending to keep something alive that only survives through your effort. You become more selective, not in a defensive way, but in a grounded way. You choose where your energy goes instead of giving it automatically. And that choice creates stability, because now your internal state is not being dictated by external inconsistency. It is being regulated from within. And that is what true emotional authority looks like. It is not about shutting down your empathy. It is about refining it, about being able to feel without absorbing, to understand without carrying, to engage without losing yourself in the process. And as that becomes more natural, something else begins to happen. You stop trying to manage other people's emotions as a way to regulate your own. You stop stepping in every time something feels off. You allow people to experience their own states without interference. And that changes the relationships around you, because the ones that depended on your overextension begin to shift. Some of them adjust, some of them fade, but all of them reveal their true structure when your effort is no longer compensating for the imbalance. And at the same time, internally, you feel something that may have been missing for a long time, a sense of space, a sense of calm that does not rely on everything being perfect, a sense of stability that comes from knowing that you are no longer responsible for everything you feel. And that is where your energy begins to return to you, not because the world has changed, but because your relationship to it has. You are no longer moving through every environment trying to fix what you sense. You are moving through it with awareness and choice. And that difference is what turns empathy from something that once controlled you into something that now works for you. And eventually, without forcing it, without making a dramatic decision or a final declaration, something inside you settles in a way it never has before. Not because the other person changed, not because the situation suddenly became clear or resolved, but because you are no longer inside it the way you used to be. You are no longer reacting to every shift. You are no longer pulled into every silence. You are no longer trying to interpret every action as something that needs your response. And in that shift, there is a kind of quiet that begins to replace the constant noise you were used to. A quiet that at first feels unfamiliar, almost empty, because for so long your attention was occupied by the loop, by the need to understand, to fix, to stay connected no matter what. And now that need is no longer driving you in the same way. And what replaces it is not indifference. It is clarity, a clarity that allows you to see the situation as it is without immediately turning it into something you need to solve. And that changes how everything feels, because the urgency fades, the emotional spikes soften, the constant pull to re-engage weakens. And in that space, you begin to notice something that may have been missing for a long time. You feel steady, not in a dramatic or overwhelming way, but in a consistent, grounded way that does not depend on someone else's behavior. And that steadiness creates a different kind of awareness, one where you can look back at the pattern without being pulled back into it, where you can recognize the moments that used to trigger you without feeling the same need to respond, where you can see the inconsistency for what it is without trying to translate it into something more meaningful than it actually is. And this is where the final shift happens, not in what you do, but in what you no longer need to do. You no longer need to chase clarity. You no longer need to earn consistency. You no longer need to prove your value through how much you can hold for someone else. And that realization changes the emotional attachment at its core, because attachment in that dynamic was never just about the person. It was about what they activated in you, the pattern, the response, the identity you stepped into every time the loop repeated. And now that pattern no longer has the same hold, not because it disappeared, but because you are no longer feeding it. You are no longer reinforcing it through your reactions, your overextension, your need to stay engaged. And as that continues, something else becomes clear. The connection that once felt so strong was not built on stability. It was built on fluctuation. It was not sustained by consistency. It was sustained by contrast. And once you are no longer dependent on that contrast, the intensity begins to lose its meaning, not in a painful way, but in a freeing way, because you are no longer measuring connection by how strongly it pulls you, but by how stable it allows you to remain. And that shift redefines everything. It changes what you are drawn to. It changes what you tolerate. It changes how you move through relationships, because you are no longer looking for something that activates you. You are looking for something that aligns with you, something that does not require you to lose yourself in order to maintain it. And in that place, something very subtle but very powerful happens. You stop waiting, not because you decided to let go, but because there is nothing left in you that needs to hold on. The loop that once kept you engaged no longer has the same pull. The questions that once kept you thinking no longer feel urgent. The absence that once created tension no longer feels like something you need to resolve. And that is when you realize that what changed was never them. It was you, your relationship to the pattern, your response to the inconsistency, your willingness to stay inside something that required you to constantly adjust. And once that changes, everything else follows naturally, not through effort, not through force, but through alignment. And maybe the most unexpected part of all of this is that you don't feel the way you thought you would at the end of it. You don't feel bitter. You don't feel closed off. You don't feel like you lost something valuable. You feel clear. You feel grounded. You feel like for the first time, you are no longer trying to manage something outside of you just to feel okay inside of you. And in that clarity, there is a quiet understanding that settles in, something that doesn't need to be repeated or reinforced. But it becomes true for you that your ability to care was never the problem. Your depth was never the problem. Your willingness to understand was never the problem. The only thing that needed to change was where you placed that energy. And once you see that, even once, you cannot go back to giving it in the same way again. And maybe for the first time, you are not hoping they come back. You are not waiting for a different version of them to appear. You are not trying to reopen something that has already shown you what it is, because now, finally, you are no longer looking at them to define how you feel. You are standing in something much more stable than that, something that does not fluctuate, something that does not depend on anyone else to exist. And that is the moment where everything becomes simple again. Not easy, but clear. And in that clarity, you are no longer asking, how do I make this work? You are simply deciding whether it ever truly did. And for the first time, you are okay with the answer not being what you once wanted it to be.